Screening for suicide risk. When we think about recognizing and supporting students who are experiencing depression or thoughts of suicide, we naturally think about the work of our mental health professionals. While our mental health professionals are the staff with the most training in identifying and intervening with youth at risk, they are the least likely to interact with students who are not already identified as needing mental health services. Every Jeffco employee who interacts with students on a daily basis has the opportunity to recognize that a student may be struggling. This is why it's our priority to train all student-facing employees. This includes teachers, mental health professionals and administrators, bus drivers, campus supervisors, coaches, paraeducators, facility managers, special service providers, food and nutrition staff, and administrative assistants. We even train the students themselves, as well as their parents, their grandparents, and any other caregiver in their life. Jeffco staff are trained to immediately report any concern involving suicide to a school's mental health professional. When you or someone else is concerned a student may be suicidal, you may have to facilitate a screener for suicide risk, or an SSR. This training will explore the SSR process from beginning to end. The SSR experience is about being present and keeping students safe. It's about slowing down and being where your feet are. It's about being human and creating an authentic connection with the student and using your unique skill set to determine if the student is an imminent risk for suicide. The protocol and the process we'll review today is not the job. These things simply exist to help us do our jobs even better. Consider the resources and the paperwork that we review today as nothing more than props and tools. It's you and your skill set and the environment you create that are the key ingredients. We'll work through this protocol through the order and the lens of priority, beginning with student safety, which involves early education, as well as how to ensure physical safety and supervision. Next, we'll show care and concern, creating an atmosphere which allows the student to feel seen, heard, and cared for. We'll spend the majority of the training on priorities 3 and 4, understanding the need, which is the actual facilitation of the SSR tool, and then at some point after the SSR is completed, we must transfer the obligation of the student safety from the school to the parent or caregiver, which requires thoughtfully communicating, educating, and equipping them to know how to best keep their child safe. Priority 5 is to provide meaningful, ongoing support for the student. And the last priority is documentation, where we'll discuss the expectations as well as the proper forms and timelines you'll need to be aware of. Let's begin with priority 1, student safety. This begins before a student is in crisis. It begins with educating our school staff on the warning signs and risk factors, how to intervene with their specific role, and how to safely connect a student to you, the mental health professional. Beginning in the 24-25 school year, all student-facing staff are trained annually through Vector so that they understand the warning signs to watch for, how to ask a student if they're having thoughts of suicide, and how to safely refer the student to you. Student-facing staff will also take SOS signs of suicide every other year, in addition to the protocol training. The Suicide Prevention Education and Protocol Review training teaches people about suicide in general and why it's important to educate ourselves, as well as what to do if there's a concern. SOS for school staff teaches people how to talk about suicide and to work through these difficult conversations with students. Since safety is our number one priority, remember, if you or another school employee is concerned a student might be suicidal, supervision is critical. Be sure that the student stays within close physical proximity of an adult at all times. How we interact with students is paramount. We should be intentional to create a welcoming and safe environment for the student, letting our words, our body language, and the physical space communicate genuine care and concern. Students are often worried that they'll be judged or that they'll get into trouble. we need to be extra intentional to reassure them of the purpose and to meet them where they are. Just because a concern comes to your attention does not automatically mean that an SSR needs to be done. Have a conversation with the student first and use your professional judgment to determine if an SSR is necessary. If you have any doubts, go ahead and do it. There is no harm in going through the process with a student, and it's better to err on the side of caution for the sake of the student's safety. Once you are sure you'll be facilitating an SSR, determine which SSR needs to be done, a full or a brief. We'll look at the difference shortly. Find a second person to facilitate with you. Ideally, this will be another trained mental health professional, but we know that's not always the case. And last, make sure to let your administrator know that you'll be facilitating an SSR. The process can take a couple of hours from beginning to end, and your administrator's support is very important. The main question we are trying to answer through the SSR process is whether or not the student has potential for imminent risk. This is determined through asking a series of 6 standardized evidence-based questions on the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. The student's answers to these questions will determine our next steps, as well as the safety and support recommendations we'll make to the parent or caregiver. In a few minutes, we'll dive deeply into this screener. You may be wondering why we use the language screener versus assessment. As school mental health professionals, we're not clinically trained to offer a full-scale assessment and definitively quantify a student's risk level. Even if we are licensed to do so in another role outside of the school system, while we're acting as a Jeffco school mental health professional, that is not the case, nor is it allowed. Our role is to understand what the student is expressing and determine if there's potential for imminent risk or not. The 6 questions on the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale explore suicidal ideation with regard to a wish to be dead, general thoughts about suicide, an identified method, intent to act, a specific plan, and suicidal behaviors or preparatory acts. The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale has a formula for making the determination of imminent risk based on the questions and how the student answers them. You will soon see that the potential for imminent risk exists if the student has identified a method, communicates their intent to act on it, and can describe a specific plan. A full-scale assessment, on the other hand, goes beyond these basic screener questions to explore suicidal ideation with regard to things like intensity, frequency, controllability, and deterrence and reasons for ideation, as well as things like actual attempts or interrupted attempts, aborted attempts, and the potential and actual lethality or medical damage of the attempts. As a school mental health professional, we're not going this in-depth with a student. We're simply trying to determine if there's potential for imminent risk. And if there is, then we're recommending that the parent or caregiver take their child to an outside clinician who can facilitate a thorough clinical assessment to determine the appropriate level of care needed to keep their child safe. We're going to spend some time now in priority number 3, understanding the need, as we now learn how to facilitate an SSR in Jeffco schools. First of all, we'll need to determine which screener to facilitate. There are 2 main types of screeners, a full screener or a brief screener. A full screener is used when it's the first screener done on a student for a particular school year. The questions on the full screener are framed in the time period of in the last month. The full screener also includes a section on gathering information about risk and protective factors present in the student's life. The brief screener has the same 6 questions as the full screener. However, the questions are framed in the time period of since we last met. The brief screener does not include the additional questions about risk and protective factors, which makes it a little bit shorter. There are 2 reasons one would use the brief screener. The first, if the student requires more than 1 SSR in the school year, after the first full screener, we'd begin using the brief screener. The second reason we would use the brief screener is if the student expressed potential for imminent risk on a screener and then returned back to school without the parent or caregiver taking them for a clinical assessment to determine the appropriate level of care needed to keep them safe. When this occurs, we must screen the student again using the brief screener to understand their current risk level and our ability to appropriately keep them safe at school. The only difference between the two brief screeners are the recommendations that we make to the parent or caregiver, as well as how we interact with them moving forward. For instance, if the brief screener was given because the student was not clinically assessed after expressing potential for imminent risk, then the school might need to consider collaborating with outside agencies such as law enforcement or child protective services. The school may also need to communicate a little differently with the family, being sure to elevate the level of concern. In a moment, we'll open up the Psychological Safety and Support Student Intervention Workbook, which is where these screeners will be accessed. The Student Intervention Workbook also provides a space to document other significant suicide-related incidents, such as in or out of school attempt, hospitalization, out of school clinical assessment, and suicide-related communication with the Jefferson Center school-based clinician. The workbook also includes resources and documentation for working with students around non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI. After we determine which screener to facilitate, remember, be sure to alert your administrator that you'll be facilitating the SSR and find your second person. Now it's time to open up the Student Intervention Workbook and get started. When you open up the workbook, this is the page you'll see. It will force you to make your own copy so that you can now write directly in the workbook. Title your copy SSR, then the date, then the student's initials. I've opened the workbook and I'm on the main page. You'll see in the bottom left-hand corner an example of how to appropriately title this workbook. SSR, and then the date, and then the student's initials. I'd like to start by pointing out the tabs that are at the bottom of this workbook. And I'm going to scroll all the way over to the right and start with these last 3 tabs, which are simply resource tabs for you. This first tab holds all of the required and supplemental resource documents you'll need for the SSR. Now, these resource documents are also linked in throughout the workbook where applicable, but this is one place that you can find them all gathered in one spot. The second tab is a step-by-step guide to the SSR process from beginning to end. If you are a linear thinker, you will find this guide to be helpful for you in terms of what to do step by step from beginning to end. If you're more of a visual spatial thinker, this third tab is a flow map which details the process from beginning to end. You can simply click on this link here to open up a PDF version so you can print it out and have it accessible anytime that you might need it. Now let's move over to the very beginning. Again, the very first tab is the main page where we started. The next 2 tabs you'll notice are colored slightly differently. At the bottom, they're yellow. These indicate that they're NSSI related or non-suicidal self-injury related. We're not going to go into detail about these tabs in this training, but I do want to quickly show you that the first tab can be used for support planning. It lists the 8 NSSI safety and support questions that you'll need when discussing with the student about their student support plan. Filling this out is not required, but you're certainly welcome to fill it out. You could also print out a hard copy to keep it accessible when you need it. The next tab is the formal report, if you will, where we capture what we discussed with the student during the NSSI support meeting, as well as the details for that meaningful support plan that you and the student created moving forward. This is the report which you'll download and send to the family. You will get to go into these in much greater detail during the NSSI training. The remainder of the tabs are related to suicide risk. The next tab over is titled Suicide Related Significant Incident. This is a very simple place to document suicide related concerns or incidents that happen primarily outside of the school. So, the way you'll fill this out is you'll just start up here putting in the student's name, date, grade, and school. You'll put your name and your title or role here, and then you'll select your school setting. Are you in person or are you one of our virtual schools? And then your reason for documentation. Was it you're documenting an attempt that happened in school, an attempt that happened out of school? Are you documenting that it came to your attention that the student had a clinical assessment, maybe in the evening or over the weekend? Was the student hospitalized? You'll document that there. Or when a Jefferson Center school based clinician communicates with you because one of your shared students had a suicide risk assessment done by their clinician, then they're going to communicate that with you if they came out as high or imminent risk, and this is where you would document that there. This pink section here, line 9, gives you a place to link in the support plan or the reentry plan if either one was created based on the nature of the incident. And this last box here is where you can describe the event or incident that led to your documentation. Let's take a look at the full screener and the brief screener now. Before we dive into the tools, a tip from the field is that many mental health professionals have decided to print out the screener so that the computer screen is not acting as a barrier during the facilitation of the SSR. Remember, the environment that we want to create is one that is comfortable and inviting and feels very personal. Sometimes a computer screen and typing on a keyboard can make the experience feel impersonal and a little more sterile. If you do decide to print it out, you'll just go to the File tab. I want to show you what it looks like here. Hit the Print button, and it prints out very nicely as a report. Some mental health professionals have gone so far as to laminate this so that they can use the same one and just wipe it off in between SSRs. I think that's a brilliant idea. If you do decide to use a paper version, it's just imperative that you go back in after the fact and input all of the information into this particular document so that you can save it and upload it later into the Google Archive and Documentation form. Okay, so let's begin walking through the full screener for suicide risk. Well, we'll start with the demographic information: student name, date, grade, school. Who are the two people facilitating the SSR and what is their title or role they have within the district? We're going to select that setting. Are we meeting in person or is this a virtual setting? Again, this pink line, number 10, gives you a place after the fact to go back in and live link in the student support plan and or the reentry plan. Now this section here, lines 12 through 18, can be skipped for most mental health professionals. This only exists if you're doing an SSR in a virtual setting. These are pre-screening safety questions for that virtual setting. So again, you may skip these if you are in a traditional brick and mortar school. The next section gives you space to describe the events leading up to the SSR. Just as you document in places like admin conference, make sure that you're stating facts only, not opinions or speculations. If you are including information about another student, please use that student's initials rather than their full name. Also, remember, this SSR is a part of the student's school record and can be given or requested at any time by the student or their parent or guardian. Okay, as we scroll down, we get to the initial screening questions. And these are the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale questions. And a couple of things you'll notice right off the bat. One, there's some color coding to this, starting with a light yellow color, moving into an orange, and then a lighter pink, and then a darker pink. The darker the colors get into the pink zone, the more severe the risk. Now, please remember, we're really only trying to answer one question. Is there potential for imminent risk? Or is there not? Now, this form makes it very easy for us to determine if there is potential for imminent risk, because the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale has standardized these questions and has a formula for determining which questions would equate to potential for imminent risk. Those questions are the ones in light pink and dark pink. So I also want to point out that the questions gradually or progressively get more and more severe in terms of nature. Starting with question 1, we're getting at a wish to be dead. And we're asking this question verbatim. In the past month, have you wished you were dead, wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? Question number 2, we're getting at a general thought about suicide. And we're asking the question, in the past month, have you actually had any thoughts of killing yourself? You'll notice that all of these questions are framed through the time frame of in the past month. Now, you'll notice that dark or that gray line after question number 2 says, if the student answers no to question 2, then we're going to skip all the rest of the questions and go down to question number 6, which gets at suicidal behaviors. Question 6 is broken into 2 parts, A and B, and I'll explain that in just a moment. If the student answers yes to question 2, then we're just going to keep going in this order. We're going to go on to question 3, which is now getting at suicidal thoughts, including a method. So the question is, in the past month, have you been thinking about how you might do this? Question 4, we're getting at thoughts with a method and intent to act on it. Question is, in the past month, have you had any thoughts? Have you had these thoughts and had some intention of acting on them? Question 5 is progressing from thoughts, method, intent to a specific plan. So the question is, in the past month, have you started to work out or worked out the details of how to kill yourself? And do you intend to carry out this plan? Again, these 2 questions in pink, if the student answers yes to even one of the light pink or dark pink questions, then that suggests that there is potential for imminent risk. Question 6A is about suicidal behaviors, or what we would call preparatory acts. So question A is asking this through the time frame of ever, or the student's lifetime. So have you ever done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? If the student answers yes to 6A, then we're moving to 6B. Now we're trying to narrow that in and figure out, has the student had any of these preparatory acts recently or within the last 3 months? So the question is, in the last 3 months, have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? So whatever the student says yes to, we're going to go ahead and just mark the box and select it. And I'm just going to mark it all the way down. But I want to show you in this gray summary box here what happens when I select these boxes. It automatically puts an X next to it down in this summary section. It gives you a quick and easy way to look below and say, did the student answer yes to any of the statements that are in red? Is there a red X next to any of the imminent risk questions? In this example, there are. Our student said yes to all 3 of them. So that alerts me as the mental health professional that my next steps are going to follow the imminent risk pathway. Okay, a couple of other things I want to show you on this screener right here. There is a notes section. If you do want to add notes, add verbatim. Don't put your thoughts or inquiries. Whatever the student says, you can go ahead and write that here. So for instance, I just told my BFF that I wish I didn't wake up this morning, something like that. You do not have to add notes, but you're more than welcome to if it is helpful. We'll scroll down now to this gray summary section and the risk and protective factors section. In the gray summary section here, it allows you to capture a general synopsis of the SSR. And below this, in the pink box, is a link to the risk and protective factors. This link is only included in the full SSR, and as you'll see in a moment, is not included in the brief SSR. The purpose of this section, the risk and protective factors, is to gain a better understanding of the student's experience at home, with friends, at school, so that we can create a plan to provide meaningful support for the student. Now, this does not need to be completed in the moment. If it makes more sense, especially if the student's in distress or is upset, to talk through this portion sometime during the support planning process or the reentry process, that makes perfect sense. If it does make sense to do it here and now, go right ahead, but just use your professional judgment to determine the most appropriate and natural time to talk through this section with the student. By checking this box here, you're acknowledging that if you're not doing it right now, that you will complete it within 24 hours or during the re-entry process. So let's go ahead and open it up. Here we go. It'll take us to a simple form, and you'll start by just typing in the student's first and last name, your name, the date of the SSR that it corresponds with, your school, which is in a drop-down, and then it goes through activating events that led up to the SSR, and then a section for optional notes, risk factors present in the student's life at this time, optional notes, and then protective factors present in the student's life as well, and with optional notes. And then we'll end by exploring what is giving the student hope right now. Again, this information you'll find to be valuable as you and the student are building a meaningful support plan. I'd like to draw your attention back to the bottom of the worksheet to the tabs. Currently, we're on the worksheet titled SSR Full Elementary. You'll notice the worksheet right next to it says Worksheet SSR Full Secondary. That's true for the brief worksheets as well. There's an elementary version and a secondary version. The wording on the questions varies a little bit to meet the developmental level. I'm now going to open up the Brief Screener tab, and we will quickly review this. It is very similar to the full screener. There are just a couple of differences. We're going to start by filling out that brief demographic information and who's facilitating the SSR. Again, we're going to select our setting. Are we in person or virtual? And we're going to select our reason for the brief screener. Is it because the student has already had a full SSR and they have ongoing thoughts or behaviors regarding suicide, so we have need to continue to screen time and time again? Or is it because the student expressed potential for imminent risk on an SSR and we recommended that the family take their child for that clinical assessment to determine the appropriate level of care, and that child returned back to school to us without having that assessment done? So in this case, we're going to say it was follow-up due to no clinical assessment. Again, line 10, this pink section just gives you a space after the fact to go back into the student's workbook and link in the updated or new student support plan and or reentry plan. Sections 12 through 18, again, are those pre-screening safety questions only applicable or needed to be asked if you are screening in a virtual setting. Again, this is familiar to you. This box here allows us to describe the events that led up to the SSR. Then we get into the actual screener questions themselves. The only difference between these questions and the ones on the full SSR is that instead of being framed in the time period of in the last month, these are framed in the time period of since we last met. Everything else works identical to the full SSR. You'll also notice that the brief SSR ends with summary notes, and there is not a section for risk and protective factors. Again, those are only included in the full SSR. I'd also like to point out that in all of the SSRs, whether brief or full, elementary or secondary, there is a green line that says suggestions, and it includes modified SSR questions for students with unique developmental or neurodiverse needs or those experiencing high levels of trauma. We have it in English and we have it in Spanish as well. The last tab to review is titled Next Steps Resource, MHP or Mental Health Professional Recommendations. So we're going to click on this here. And when you open it, you'll see red letters up at the top that say for office use only. This worksheet is not to be shared with families. In fact, it's not even something that you have to complete. What it is a quick reminder cheat sheet or roadmap, if you will, to help you, the person who facilitated the SSR, know what your next steps are with regard to things like parent caregiver notification, safety recommendations you'll make to the family, depending on which type of SSR you did, support and or reentry planning needs, and then your documentation expectations, and so on. It's broken into a handful of different sections here, divided by this bold blue line. The top one are your next steps and recommendations following a full SSR. And then we get down to the brief. We've got a separate one for each of the two different types of brief screeners. This one we're looking at here is when we do a brief screener because the student was not clinically assessed after expressing imminent risk. And the third one here is the brief screener, and this is the one that we do when there's an ongoing concern and we've already done a full SSR. And the last one is documentation. We don't always have next steps following a simple documentation, but sometimes we do. For instance, if the student made a suicide attempt or was hospitalized, it would be important for us to put student support measures in place and most likely hold a reentry plan. So this details next steps and when they are applicable following a documentation. I do want to point out on the brief SSR, the one here, when we're doing it because there's no clinical assessment done following a potential for imminent risk, the thing that's different here than it is from the one below is that our next steps might ramp up just a little bit. We might have a collaborative conversation with our SRO or dispatch. We might have to make a report to Child Protective Services, or we might request a welfare check after school hours. We probably wouldn't do these things for a brief SSR, when it's just an ongoing concern. But again, in the situation where the family did not take that child for that clinical assessment, we're going to have to amp up our safety measures. So the next step recommendations are going to look just a little bit different, which is why we have it broken into two different sections here. I want to point out that you'll notice there are essentially two pathways, a non-imminent risk pathway and a potential for imminent risk pathway. The non-imminent risk pathway is going to be more in that yellow-orange coloring, and the potential for imminent risk, that light and dark pink. So again, however the student rated out, if you will, if they expressed imminent risk or if they did not, that tells you now which pathway to follow. So it's quite simple. If non-imminent risk was expressed, we're just going to want to make sure that we do these four things here. If imminent risk was expressed, then we have a few more items to make sure that we're taking care of with regard to that student safety and follow-up care. I'm not going to review this in great detail because this almost identically matches the safety and acknowledgement form, which I am going to open up here in just a minute. The safety and acknowledgement form is essentially your agenda or your checklist, that thing that you can walk through when you meet with parents and caregivers to make sure that they understand everything and that you are providing them with not just the physical documentation or resources, but also electronic copies. We'll open that up here in just a moment. I also want to point out the next step recommendations are the same no matter if it was an elementary age child, ages 6 through 11, or a secondary age student. So let's go ahead and open the safety and acknowledgement form. This is the document that you will use to review the incident with the parents and caregivers following the SSR. It includes all of the steps we just reviewed and will not only help to keep you on track, but you will also send an electronic copy of this via email to the family so that they'll have access to all of the live links for the documents that you are reviewing with them. Let's take a quick look at it so you can see what I'm referring to. You'll want to take a few moments before you meet with the family to fill this out. You'll place an X in the box next to the statements that the student said yes to. So I'm going to put an example here in this first top gray box. Sometimes during the SSR process, a student says no to every single question. If that's the case, we would just put an X in that box. We, along with the family, would determine if ongoing support would be helpful. With the family, we can also decide if a student support plan would be helpful. It's optional, not required. Now let's look at the non-imminent risk pathway, this yellow section here. Let's say the student answered yes to a wish to be dead and suicidal thoughts. Then we're going to make these next step recommendations that are in this box over here. We're going to recommend or encourage the family to have their child engage in ongoing support from a mental health professional. And we've included some possible resources here that could be no cost or low cost to the family. Of course, the family could certainly choose a therapist of their own that's covered by their own insurance. But we've got listed Jefferson Center, Hazel Health, iMatter Colorado, and Second Wind Fund. We're also asking that you create a student support plan with the family and that you review page 1 of the Making It Safely Through a Suicidal Crisis document. And this is what this looks like. The first page goes over some facts related to youth suicide, especially pointing out how quickly a suicidal crisis can escalate, most of the time in less than 30 minutes. It then goes into different ways that families can safeguard their homes, how they might think about safely storing firearms, locking and limiting medications, other ways to help, including crisis lines, and they are listed here. A whole host of them are listed here, as well as Colorado Crisis Service walk-in location centers. We'll go back to the safety and acknowledgement form now. Now, again, you're only reviewing page 1 with the family when you're there, but when they receive this document, they will have a link to the full 4-page resource. In our scenario, for this training course, a student answered yes to thoughts with a method, intent, and a specific plan. So we would be reviewing the pink section in terms of next steps. We'd ask the family to provide supervision for their child at all times. We'd ask them to have their child clinically assessed by an out-of-school mental health provider who can do a full clinical assessment to determine the most appropriate level of care to keep their child safe. We provide a couple of resources here. They certainly can take their child to an emergency department and a hospital of their choosing or to a walk-in center. If they do have a therapist who is trained and willing, that's another option in terms of that full clinical assessment. Now, this piece here is suggesting a way that we as the mental health professional can support the family in this process. This can be a very scary and confusing time for families, and most of the time it takes them into uncharted territory. So, in an effort to help families to make it safely through this crisis, it really can be helpful for us to spend time with the family, helping them to understand and plan out their next steps. So, we're calling it a transfer plan, and this can involve helping them determine where they would like to take their child. Number 2, starting that intake process by calling the agency or the location ahead of time together, letting them know who the child is, what the concern is, how far away they are, and when they should be expected to arrive. We can also help by asking questions so that the family knows exactly what to expect with regard to things like where do they park when they get there, which door do they enter, where do they go once they arrive, and who do they ask for, anything in particular that they should be bringing with them. Slowing down and spending quality time with the family at this stage in the game really does significantly increase the chances that the family will take it seriously and make it from point A, the school, to point B, wherever that location is that they're taking their child for the clinical assessment. Our job at this point is to demystify what comes next through transparency and through removing barriers with empathy, with respect, and with compassion. This is one way that we can do this and do this well. If the family is willing, right there on the spot, try to have them sign a release of information. If not right then, maybe at a later date. But it is helpful so that we can speak to outside mental health professionals to provide a seamless continuum of care. We're going to be completing or reviewing the Making It Safely Through a Suicidal Crisis document again, whether they're an imminent risk or non-imminent risk. That's why it's listed here twice in both sections. And then before they leave, we're going to be scheduling that re-entry meeting. If the child does express potential for imminent risk, there is a good chance that they will miss 3 or more days of school due to this suicidal crisis. So let's go ahead and schedule that meeting for 3 days out. And go ahead and type it in here or write it in here for the family and give it to them. Now, if the child returns to school before they've missed 3 days, or let's say they get hospitalized and have an even longer extended absence, that's okay. We can very easily cancel or move the meeting date. But if we don't get it on the books, it's likely that student will show up back to school at some point without having that reentry meeting first. Now, another piece of information, we want to give the family and we want to point out to them that the reentry plan template is linked right in here, or give them a physical copy of it. In an effort to engage the family and help to elevate their voice and let them know that their voice is valuable, if they can review that reentry plan ahead of time, then they can come to the table prepared. They can gather their family and their own support network and be thinking ahead of time about what may or may not be helpful for their child as they reintegrate into the school setting. And at the bottom, if you would just list the primary person's name, contact number, and email so that if the family needs to get in touch with you, they don't have to go searching for your contact information. It's just right there. And last, again, I would give a physical copy of this as well as send it to them via email so that they've got live links to everything that we want the parents and caregivers to have. Now that we've screened the student using the respective Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, and we understand the sections of the Safety and Acknowledgement Form, it's time to dig into priority number 4, engaging the parents and caregivers and transferring the obligation of the student's safety from us, the school personnel, back to the family. Remember, this is a time to slow down and engage in a meaningful conversation with the family. This can be scary and overwhelming, embarrassing, and unknown territory for families. It's our opportunity to work collaboratively with them in a direct and compassionate manner. There are a handful of things that we can do to bring comfort, education, and guidance to the family so that they can do their very best to help keep their child safe through this suicidal crisis. This includes number 1, sharing honest facts about youth suicide. Number 2, educating families about mean safety. And number 3, offering those next step recommendations. Let's explore each of these 3 one at a time, starting with facts about youth suicide. It's not uncommon for parents and caregivers to underestimate the level of severity, whether it's due to denial or overwhelm or frustration. We need to meet them where they are, and we need to help them understand just how rapidly suicidal ideation can turn into an acute crisis. So, in other words, how quickly suicidal thoughts can become suicidal behaviors or actions. In fact, the average time that passes from decision to action is only 8 to 11 minutes. This is a sobering statistic, and if parents and caregivers are not aware of it, they may be inclined to believe that just because their child is now in the backseat of the car distracted or giggling, that they're fine and that they no longer need that clinical assessment to determine the appropriate level of care for their safety. What you see on the screen now is page 1 of Making It Safely Through a Suicidal Crisis, the resource which you'll send to them. This page 1 just hits the highlights when you're meeting with them. And then you want to let them know that there's much more detailed information for them to review about ways to safeguard their home. Which brings us to the next point, which is emphasizing with parents and caregivers the life-saving importance of means safety. Because suicidal crises can escalate so quickly, when a lethal method is unavailable at the height of a crisis, the likelihood that that crisis will pass without a fatal outcome is significantly increased. And one last time, we'll quickly recap the steps you'll take and the recommendations you'll make to the parents or caregivers. So again, if the student did not express imminent risk, a phone call to the parent is perfectly appropriate. A meeting's okay, but a phone call is fine. The student should be able to stay at school. You'll review the safety and acknowledgement form with the family, and you'll create a student support plan with the student and maybe including the family as well. If the student does express potential for imminent risk, the parent or caregiver should come in person. You'll review that safety and acknowledgement form with them. You'll recommend that they take their child for a clinical assessment to determine the appropriate level of care needed to keep their child safe. And if they're willing, you'll do a transfer plan with them to help them make it from point A to point B. Before they leave, you'll want to give them blank copies of the reentry plan and the student support plan and schedule that reentry plan for 3 days out. Remember, if their absence is less than 3 days or longer than 3 days, we can very easily move or cancel that meeting. But if we don't do it, it's likely that it won't happen. And last on this screen, the link there is tips for you in working with families, especially through the most difficult conversations, and put some language to our obligations as Jeffco employees and some of the decisions and actions that we may need to take. Notifying and collaborating with parents and caregivers through this process can be unpredictable. You may be faced with a variety of responses, and you'll want to be ready to address them. Responses could look like the ideal response here: a father who shows their child that they are not alone and does all he can to support his son. A parent who's in denial or refuses to take it seriously because they believe their child is just trying to get attention or makes threats all the time and they're tired of it. A situation where the parents begin to finger point and argue, and now the attention has shifted from meeting the child's needs to the dysfunction happening between the parents or caregivers. How about this scenario where a child's fear is realized and the parents get back at her for being suicidal, for causing drama in the family, and getting angry with the child? And last, a parent who emotionally just falls apart, and the child now is in the position to comfort the parent. No matter what you're met with, remember this is a time to slow down and listen for understanding. We never know what beliefs, fears, stories, and experiences people are bringing with them through your door. Be slow to judge and quick to offer compassion. Priority number 5, ongoing support. Providing ongoing support for the student and the family begins before your meeting is over. Be sure to give them a blank copy of both the student support plan and the reentry plan. In the spirit of removing barriers and inviting authentic engagement, we want to empower families to have a voice at the table when they come for that reentry meeting. It can be quite intimidating to show up at a meeting in a conference room with a large table full of school staff members and not know exactly what will be discussed and without having time to prepare for it. Giving them blank copies ahead of time allows them to think about who they'd like to bring with them and who to consult with in their own support network as they're thinking through the reentry plan and support considerations. Remember, a reentry meeting should occur if the student misses 3 or more days of school due to the suicidal crisis. This meeting is a thoughtful way to reintegrate the student back into the school setting in a supportive and safe manner. Let's take a quick look at the student support plan and the reentry plan. This is Jeffco's student support plan, and it's been adapted from the Stanley and Brown safety plan. What other agencies refer to as a safety plan is called a student support plan in Jeffco schools. It starts by helping the student to think about their own emotional and physical warning signs. We then take a look at what's supportive for the student both outside of school and during the school day or in the school environment. The blue section refers to outside of school, and the green section refers to during the school day. We start with identifying those students' warning signs and what it might look like to their family members or their trusted adults at school. What would these folks notice? We then get into who those people are and the people in the social settings that provide distraction for that person. Also, how and when will the student access those trusted people in their life? We then move into how to make that student's environment safe. At home, we're referring to lethal means safety or safeguarding their home. And at the school day, in addition to that, we're thinking about things that they can do on their own or with the help of school staff regarding internal calming and coping strategies. Now, Jeffco does follow the 5 rules when it comes to calming and coping strategies. And these are the 5 rules that come out of Face Your Fears, which is the model that we use to support students struggling with anxiety. The calming or coping strategy must work. It must not draw attention. It must be safe. It must be portable, and it must not lead to avoidance. If you need some support and some very helpful visuals in working with the student and thinking about emotional and physical warning signs, how their bodies react, and what corresponding calming strategies might be, this link here will prove to be very helpful. Over here, we have listed professional resources and referrals in a crisis. And then we will end with talking about what ongoing support will look like from the school's mental health professional. Now, the reentry plan that Jeffco uses looks like this. The top section, or those sections highlighted in yellow, which is just this very top section here, should be reviewed or filled out before the family leaves. First, we're identifying who would they like to invite to the reentry meeting, both people outside of school and people in the school building. And then we're going to schedule that reentry meeting. Again, it's perfectly fine to change or cancel the reentry meeting, but if we don't already have it scheduled on the books, there's a high chance that we'll have a difficult time getting it scheduled after the family leaves. So again, we'll fill out this top section with the family and then give them the rest of it blank so that they can take it home with their doctor, their therapist, their family, or their support network. They can begin thinking about what we're going to discuss at the meeting, which are these blue sections here in steps 3 through 6. So who are those supportive staff and peers at school? What are those coping skills or those calming strategies that work for the student? So we're either going to fill out or review the student support plan at this time. Then we're going to identify temporary accommodations. The key word here is temporary. Those are those temporary accommodations that might help the student to more successfully or seamlessly transition back into the school setting, such as a reduced schedule, a reduced workload, extension of makeup work without penalty, tutoring from peers, and so on. What are those temporary accommodations we agreed on? We'll list those here, and over in this box, any staff member in the school who might be responsible in helping to implement that. Step 6 is just talking about what ongoing safety and support looks like for the student, as well as ongoing communication with the family. And then we're going to circle back with the student in 3 days, which is step 7. We're going to select that date just to check in and see how the reentry plan accommodations and supports are going and what we need to consider for further support for that student. The last thing I'd like to show us here is the SSR Resource Bank. This can be sort of a one-stop shop for all things that you might need for the SSR. So we've got the safety and acknowledgement form, the student support plan, the reentry plan, the release of information, that document making it safely through a suicidal crisis, crisis resources, the lifeline phone numbers and walk-in clinics, and ways to safeguard your home. They're all quick linked here in English, Spanish, Russian, and Vietnamese. If you need them in another language, please feel free to contact the Student Services Department's Psychological Safety and Support Team. Our contact information is here in this bottom right-hand box, or reach out to Jeffco's Translation Services on your own. We've got additional resources listed here in this large box, and up in the top right-hand corner, answers to frequently asked questions, tips for working with families when their student has expressed potential for imminent risk, and our guidelines for documenting in Jeffco. We'll now return to ongoing support and take a look at the other considerations. It may or may not have made sense to discuss the risk and protective factors with the student at the time of the SSR. That's okay. Remember, this can be done anytime, 24 hours following the SSR or at the support planning meeting or the reentry meeting. It's important, though, because it does help us to better understand the student's experience at home, with friends, and at school. It allows us to think through and wrap meaningful support around the student. And last, let's work together with others who care about the student, invite them into the process, and continue checking in with the student. The 3 months following an attempt or a serious suicidal crisis can be especially vulnerable. And the more that we check in, the more protected the student is. Finally, we've arrived at the documentation section. While it is a necessary step, it is last on the list of priority. And truth be told, if we focus on the purpose, the compliance will take care of itself. There are 3 main steps to be aware of with regard to documentation. 2 are required and 1 is suggested. All are pretty self-explanatory. You'll have 24 hours following the SSR to complete these top 2 documentation steps. The first is within the Google Archive and Documentation form. In here, you'll answer demographic questions, the outcome of the SSR, and then you'll upload the SSR form itself. Next, the second bullet is documenting in the JPS Secure tab. We've made this simple because we have pre-written documentation statements for you to use. So all you need to do is copy the pertinent statement and customize it. Last, again, this is optional, though highly recommended. Once you finalize the student support plan and or the reentry plan, link them back into the student's SSR workbook. This way you can keep everything together in one place for the student. I'm now going to open up the SSR Google Archive and Documentation form so you can take a look at what it looks like. We'll start with general demographic information, the date, the name of the staff member completing the form, your school's articulation area, your school, if your school is classified as Title I, the student's first and last name and ID number, student's grade, student's age, how the student identifies, and their ethnicity. Okay, now we're done with the demographics, and we'll move over to the type of documentation that we're doing. Are we documenting an NSSI support meeting, a full SSR, a brief SSR for either of these 2 reasons, or are we documenting a significant suicide-related incident? For this training course, we're documenting a full SSR. And here's where we select the outcome or documentation. So if we are documenting a significant suicide-related incident, we're going to select the one here that makes sense in this situation. Or are we documenting an SSR? If so, we're going to move down to these 3 at the bottom. Did the student answer no to all the questions? Did the student not express potential for imminent risk, or did the student, in fact, express potential for imminent risk? In our case, the student did because they had a specific plan, a method, and intent. So we're going to mark imminent risk. Was the SSR completed as the result of a NSSI support meeting? In our case, it was not. You'll learn more about this in the NSSI training. Was a medication lock bag given? Many of our schools were given a handful of medication lock bags through a grant. Some of those have run out by now, but if your school still happens to have some and you do give one to the family, go ahead and mark yes. In our case, the answer was no, we did not give one. And the name of the parent or guardian who was contacted or notified. We'll hit next. And here's where we upload the completed SSR or NSSI report if we're documenting for that reason. So we'll simply click Add File, and I will go to my Google Drive. I'm going to go to the folder where I save my SSRs titled SSR 2425. And again, we title them SSR with the date and the student's initials. So I've got mine stored right here. Hit select and insert, and now it's uploaded. This box here is for any other documentation you'd like to upload. It's optional, but this might be things such as drawings, writings, or notes. The last box here just reminds us to document in the JPS Secure tab in Infinite Campus, and then we'll go ahead and hit Submit. I'm going to open this up so we can take a quick look at what documenting in the JPS Secure tab looks like. You'll notice at the very top gives instructions for how to fill in the drop-down boxes in the JPS Secure tab. It's important to note that each drop-down box must be completed, otherwise it will not let you save the entry. So we've kind of made a cheat sheet for you here for what you need to select in those drop-downs. Then there is an example for each of the different types of documentation. So the full SSR, which is what we did, is here. Again, we've made it very simple for you. All you'll need to do is copy the pre-written statement and customize it. So you'll add in the date and whether or not the student expressed potential for imminent risk. And that's what you'll copy into the JPS Secure tab. So there's an example for full SSR, both brief SSRs, if you're documenting a significant suicide-related incident, or if you are documenting communication from a Jefferson Center school-based clinician around a high or elevated risk SSRA that they completed on one of your shared students, or are you documenting initial support meeting for NSSI? Down at the bottom, this takes you to Jeffco's district-wide general documentation guidelines around all types of issues, such as child protection, threat management, discipline, safety, and it gives instructions for what to do in JPS Secure, Admin Conference, and Behavior tab. We've made it to the end of Jeffco's SSR protocol training course, and we've covered a lot of information today. The resource page provided to you includes links to everything that we've discussed during this course. As mental health professionals, keeping students safe, especially through a suicidal crisis, is a responsibility that we're uniquely trained to do. However, it's not always easy, and in many cases, consultation with our colleagues is needed. Please remember that we in Student Services are simply an extension of your team, and we're here to support you. We invite you to reach out to us for anything that you need. Please know we appreciate you immensely for the work that you do, and we sincerely thank you.